I never expected to see him again, at least not like that. Not with the sun catching the angles of his face, not with that voice deeper than I remembered, and certainly not with the way he looked at me like he knew something I didn't. It was the first quiet Saturday in June, one of those gentle mornings where the air still carried a trace of spring before the heat of summer claimed it for good. I'd been in the front garden, my hands buried in the soil, tending to the lavender that had started to spread too wildly across the brick path. That's when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway next door. It wasn't the usual rumble of Mary's old SUV. This one was sleeker, newer. And the moment I glanced up, I felt something stir in me that I couldn't name. The car door opened, and there he was, Caleb Mary's son, stepping out with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a book tucked under his arm. He looked taller, older, broader in the shoulders. Gone was the awkward teenager who used to wave shyly from his bike on his way to school. In his place stood a young man with a quiet confidence and a presence that filled the space around him like sunlight fills a room. I stood, brushing dirt from my knees. "Caleb?" He turned, his eyes lighting up with a smile I hadn't seen in years. "Hi, Ms. Winslow. Long time." I blinked against the sun, suddenly aware of the sweat at my temple, the smudge of dirt on my cheek. "I wasn't expecting you back." He walked over close enough now that I could see the faint scar above his brow, the one he got falling off the fence when he was 10. "Just got in last night. Thought I'd surprise Mom." "Well, you certainly did," I said, forcing a smile I didn't quite understand. "How was school?" "Better than I thought it'd be. Harder, too." We talked for a few more minutes about the drive, about Mary's reaction when he showed up, and though the words were simple, something about his voice pulled me in. It had a richness now, a calmness that wasn't there before. Before he turned to go inside, he paused. "Maybe I'll stop by later. I've been meaning to catch up properly." I nodded, too surprised by the flutter in my stomach to say much. "Sure, I'll be home." And I was, all day. I kept busy laundry, dusting, baking a batch of oatmeal cookies I didn't need, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that smile, that voice, the way he'd looked at me. Not like a neighbor, not like a kid, but like someone really seeing me for the first time in a very long while. When he knocked that evening, the sun was low, casting long, golden shadows across the porch. He held a small bouquet of daisies, awkward and charming in equal measure. "Thought you might like these," he said. I didn't say it, but I did. We sat out back sipping iced tea, the cicadas just beginning their evening song. He told me about his classes, his roommate, a girl he dated briefly. I listened, smiling more than I had in weeks, and every so often he'd say something that caught me off guard. Not because it was shocking, but because it was thoughtful, kind, and somehow directed at me, not just to me. "You still have that peaceful energy," he said once softly, like it was a secret. "It's nice." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just smiled and poured him more tea. But something had changed. I felt it in the way my chest tightened when he looked at me, in the warmth that stayed long after he left. It wasn't something I understood yet. It wasn't something I dared name. But it was there, lingering like the scent of lavender on my fingers. And for the first time in years, I found myself hoping he'd come by again. The next afternoon brought a quiet that settled over the neighborhood like a soft blanket. The wind stirred the wind chimes on my porch, and somewhere down the block, a lawnmower hummed in the distance. I had spent most of the morning cleaning out the pantry, more from restlessness than necessity. By lunchtime, I found myself glancing toward the fence, half listening for footsteps that never came. I was in the kitchen rinsing blueberries when I heard the knock. Just 3 soft taps on the screen door. I didn't have to check to know it was him. Caleb stood there with a paper bag in one hand and the same easy smile on his face. "Hope you haven't had lunch yet," he said. I raised an eyebrow. Are you trying to bribe me with food? Maybe, he said, stepping inside. Chicken salad sandwiches. From that little deli on Maple Street. Figured you might like them. I smiled, despite myself. You remembered. I remember a lot of things, he said quietly, placing the bag on the counter. We sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight striping across the tablecloth like gold. The sandwiches were good, but it was the ease of conversation that I found myself savoring. Caleb asked about the neighborhood, the changes he'd missed, the people who'd moved in or out. He listened closely, like every detail mattered. At some point, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, this kitchen smells exactly the same. Like vanilla and oranges. I used to love that." "It's probably the candle," I said. "I still light the same kind." He smiled. "It's comforting." There was something about the way he said it, gentle, sincere, that made me pause. I saw him then not as a college kid home for break, but as someone who had grown into himself, someone who had lived just enough to be changed by it. We took our tea out to the back porch again. The sun was warmer than the day before, and the air had that faint sweetness that only comes with summer pressing in. "You were always kind to me," he said after a long silence. "When I was a teenager, I didn't really talk to many adults, but you always made it easy." "I didn't do much," I replied. "You did more than you think," he said. I looked at him then, searching for the boy I once knew. He was still there in the slope of his shoulders, in the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he spoke. But there was something more now, calm, attentive, thoughtful. "I'm glad you came back," I said quietly, surprising myself. He turned to me, his expression soft. "Me too." That evening, after he'd left, I stood alone on the porch for a long time, listening to the breeze through the trees, feeling something I hadn't in years, a kind of aliveness, not loud or urgent, but steady and warm. Something was shifting. I didn't know what to call it, only that it was real. The rain started just after 3. It came in slow, steady waves, tapping gently against the windows as if asking for permission to stay. I was upstairs in the small room I rarely entered anymore, the one that used to be a reading nook, then became storage, then a quiet place to forget. I'd been sorting through old boxes, the kind that collect dust and memory in equal measure. Letters, faded photos, a few postcards from places I barely remembered visiting. And then tucked beneath an old linen tablecloth, I found a note from Michael. My late husband's handwriting unmistakable in its loops and slants. It was nothing dramatic, just a scribbled reminder to buy milk and something about meeting for lunch. But the sight of it hit me like a wave. It's strange how something so small can stir everything up again. I was still sitting on the floor when I heard a knock. At first, I considered ignoring it. I wasn't sure I wanted company, but something told me to get up to answer. Caleb stood there holding a paperback wrapped in plastic and 2 steaming paper cups. "Rainy day delivery," he said, lifting the book slightly. "You mentioned liking Nora Wilder. I saw this at a used shop and thought of you." I stepped aside a little dazed. "That's thoughtful. Thank you. I brought tea too," he added. "Chamomile. Hope that's okay." We settled into the living room, the sound of rain filling the quiet spaces between us. I sipped the tea, slowly grateful for its warmth. Caleb didn't press me to talk. He just sat there flipping through the book he brought, comfortable in the silence. Eventually, I said I found something upstairs. From my husband. It wasn't much, but it took me back farther than I expected. He looked up, meeting my eyes. "You miss him." Not in the way people think I said. "I miss the version of us that existed before things got hard. Before life changed us." He nodded, slowly. "My dad left when I was 11. Just packed up and disappeared. I used to think I was over it, but every now and then it catches me off guard. Like I'm still waiting for an apology that's never coming." I didn't expect that. The calm way he said it. The honesty. You carry that well, I said. I've had practice, he replied, smiling faintly. But it's different being back here. Feels like everything I didn't say is still floating in the air. The room fell quiet again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt safe, like we'd both placed something fragile between us and agreed to guard it gently. I looked at him, really looked, and realized that the boy I once knew had become a man with quiet wounds and a soft strength. He wasn't trying to fix anything. He was just showing up. And for some reason, that mattered more than I could explain. When he left, he didn't say much, just a soft, "See you tomorrow," and a touch of his fingers on my arm as he passed. That night, I held the book he gave me against my chest and listened to the rain. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe the past didn't have to be packed away in boxes. Maybe it could sit beside me alongside whatever this new thing was becoming. The sun returned on Sunday bright and soft, as if it too had needed a moment to rest. I was already out back tying up the tomato plants and brushing off dead petals when I heard the gate swing open. Caleb didn't call out. He just walked in like he'd done it 100 times before, and I didn't mind. He carried a basket with gardening gloves and a small spade, a lopsided grin on his face. "Thought I'd offer my services," he said. "It's either this or help my mom rearrange the garage again." I handed him a pair of gloves. "You made the right choice." We worked side by side in the garden for most of the morning. There was a quiet rhythm to it, dig, plant, water, brush the soil. Occasionally, we'd exchange a thought about the weather or how well the herbs were doing, but most of the time we didn't speak. And somehow that silence said more than words could. At one point, he stood up, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "You always made this place feel like a home. Even when I was a kid, I'd come by just to sit near the fence and listen to you hum while you worked." I didn't realize he remembered that. He looked around the yard, then back at me. "You have this way of making things feel steady, safe." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and returned to the pot I was replanting. Later, we sat on the porch steps drinking lemonade from mismatched glasses, our hands stained with dirt and sunlight. A breeze moved through the trees, and the moment felt impossibly still. He glanced over at me, a quiet seriousness settling over him. "Do you ever feel like people forget how to really see each other?" "All the time," I said without thinking. "Well," he said, shifting slightly toward me, "I see you. Not just now. I think I always did." The words landed gently, but with weight. I looked at him, this young man who wasn't supposed to matter this much, and felt the unmistakable flutter of something alive inside me. "I'm older than you," I said, not as a defense, just as a truth I needed to name aloud. "I know. And this, whatever this is, it's complicated." He nodded, but not impossible. I watched him then, and he didn't flinch or look away. He wasn't trying to charm or convince me. He was just sitting there offering something honest. And I didn't have to accept it, but I also didn't have to deny that I felt it too. His hand was resting on the step beside mine. I didn't move away. I didn't move toward him either. We just sat like that in the warmth and the hush of early summer, with something unspoken stretching between us, neither fragile nor rushed, just quietly waiting. That evening after he left, I stood in the garden alone. The dirt still clung to my hands, but I couldn't bring myself to wash it off yet, because something had been planted that day. Not just in the soil, but in me. The days that followed settled into a quiet pattern, though something beneath it had shifted. Caleb came by often, sometimes with a book to lend me, sometimes with nothing but time, and that steady presence I'd begun to rely on more than I should have. One afternoon, he showed up with 2 coffees and a slightly nervous look in his eye. "I hope you're not tired of me yet," he said, offering 1 cup with a half smile. "I'd tell you if I were," I said, teasing just enough to hide the fact that I never was. We sat at the dining table, the light from the window falling across his face in a way that made him seem older, more certain. He was quieter than usual, and I could feel the tension gathering around him like a storm waiting for permission. After a long silence, he said, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." I set my coffee down. "I've been thinking about this. About us. I don't know what this is exactly, and I'm not asking you to define it. But I need you to know this isn't just a passing thing for me. I don't feel this way often. I don't connect with people like this." I didn't interrupt. I could see how much it cost him to say it. He leaned forward slightly, his hands wrapped around the mug like he was grounding himself. "When I'm around you, I feel more myself, and I don't want to pretend that doesn't matter." I let out a slow breath. My first instinct was to guard, to retreat into practicality and logic. The voice in my head reminded me of all the reasons why this couldn't work: his age, the neighbors, the expectations of everyone who would never understand. But the other voice, the quieter one, whispered of the way he made me feel seen, heard, remembered. "It scares me," I admitted. "Not because I don't feel something, but because I do. And I've spent so long keeping myself still, like that was the safest way to be. And now, you come back and tilt the whole floor under my feet. I'm not trying to shake your life up," he said. "I just want to be part of it. Even if it's small. Even if it's slow." There was something in the way he looked at me then, not with urgency, but with care that undid something in me. "You're still figuring yourself out," I said. He nodded. "I am. But I know this much: I trust how I feel when I'm around you. And I don't want to pretend it's nothing." I reached across the table, my fingers grazing his, not a declaration, but an acknowledgement. He didn't move, just let the contact remain quiet and respectful. "Then we go slow," I said. "No promises, no rushing, just honesty. That's all I want," he replied. We sat there for a long time after that, not as neighbors, not as mismatched figures trying to fit some mold, but as two people quietly allowing something to exist. Not defined, not explained, just real. That night, I stood by the window long after he left, watching the stars blink to life in the summer sky. I didn't have answers, but for the first time in a long time, I felt open to the questions. It was one of those ordinary days that sneaks up on you, quiet, unremarkable, but somehow etched into memory before it even ends. I spent the morning baking more out of habit than hunger, and by late afternoon the house smelled of cinnamon and warm fruit. Caleb arrived just as I was pulling the cobbler from the oven. He didn't knock this time. He'd started doing that lately, just walking in like he belonged, like this house was a place he could simply arrive at and be welcome. And strangely, it felt right. "You always know when to show up," I said. "Maybe I'm just lucky," he replied, flashing a smile that had softened over the weeks into something quieter, something familiar. We ate dessert on the front porch, the cicadas humming in the background. There were no deep conversations that day, no careful steps around delicate truths. We talked about books, about a neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking, about nothing important at all. But the way he laughed, the way he tilted his head to listen fully, made it all feel important anyway. At one point, I noticed him watching me, not staring, just looking, really looking, as if trying to memorize me in that moment. What I asked, brushing a crumb from my chin. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just, this feels good. Being here." I nodded. "It does." A breeze moved across the porch, lifting the edges of the tablecloth. For a second, neither of us spoke. "I used to think love had a shelf life," I said, surprising myself. "Like if you missed your moment, that was it. But maybe it just changes form." Caleb leaned back, arms crossed loosely. "I think love shows up in strange ways, at strange times. And if you're lucky, you notice before it passes by." His voice was low, not heavy with meaning, but full of it all the same. There was no need to name what this was. It didn't ask for that. It just asked for space, for attention, for care. As the sun dipped lower and the air began to cool, he reached for my hand, not as a question this time, but as something known, something steady. Our fingers met, and we stayed like that, watching the world slow down. In the silence that followed, there was no need for declarations. The feeling was already there between us, woven into the ordinary moments we kept choosing to share. And that was enough. It's strange how the heart adjusts, how one day you wake up and realize that the weight you've been carrying for years has shifted, become lighter, maybe even begun to dissolve altogether. That was how it felt that morning. I was standing in the kitchen stirring honey into my tea, watching the light move across the floor in slow ripples, when I heard his voice. "Morning," Caleb said, stepping into the room like he belonged there, like he always had. He carried 2 cups of coffee and a brown paper bag from the bakery on Oakwood. They had cranberry orange muffins, he said. "Thought of you?" I smiled, warmed not just by the gesture, but by the way it felt so normal, now, so easy. We sat at the table, talking like we always did. I told him about the neighbor who still hadn't taken down their Christmas lights, and he told me about the literature class he was excited to start in the fall. We laughed. We paused. We drifted into comfortable silences. But through it all, something steadier had taken root, something I no longer questioned. Later that day, we went for a walk by the lake, a simple trail shaded by tall oaks. Birds chattered overhead and the gravel crunched beneath our feet. He reached for my hand without hesitation, and I took it without fear. We didn't talk much during that walk. We didn't need to. At one point, as we sat on a bench overlooking the water, he turned to me and said, "I think some people spend their whole lives looking for something that feels like this." Like what I asked softly. He thought for a moment. Like home. Not the place, but the feeling, the person. I didn't answer. I just leaned my head against his shoulder, and we stayed that way, listening to the wind in the trees and the quiet rhythm of everything around us. That night after he left, I stood on the porch for a long while, wrapped in the cool hush of evening. I thought about the woman I had been before this summer, the one who had packed her heart into safe boxes and closed every window to anything unexpected. She was still here, but different now. And Caleb, he hadn't come crashing in. He hadn't tried to rewrite my story. He'd simply shown up again and again until I remembered what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted, not out of obligation or fantasy, but simply because I was me. I don't know where this leads. I don't need to. What I do know is that life has a way of surprising us even when we think the best chapters are behind us. Sometimes they're just beginning. And maybe, just maybe, the heart knows exactly when to open again. If you've been listening and something in this story spoke to you, whether it reminded you of someone you once loved or something you're still hoping for, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me. Have you ever felt seen by someone unexpected? And if you want more stories like this, quiet, real, and full of heart, please consider subscribing. Thank you for spending time here with me. Until next time.